For me personally, Joe Montana, my entire life, he's been the standard at the quarterback position. Ever since he retired, I've always compared every quarterback after him to him. I hold them all to that standard. I think probably the person probably most instrumental in, apart from Joe Montana himself, in me holding him in such high regard as a child, particularly, was probably John Madden, because John Madden never spoke about another quarterback in as high a regard as he did Joe Montana. He always referred to, like, Lawrence Taylor was the greatest defensive player he'd ever seen, and Joe Montana was the greatest offensive player he'd ever seen. And other people might have shown Joe Montana disrespect and hyped up other people or saying that other people were better, but John Madden didn't do that. He always stood out in that regard, that he always, and I always valued his opinion. And in comparing every quarterback after Montana and holding them to his standard, I always held him to the standard of no Super Bowl losses and always playing well in Super Bowls. And no quarterback since has since him has won 4 Super Bowls with no losses. Terry Bradshaw did it before him, but after him, Troy Aikman got to 3 and never got to a fourth. And even in the 3 he played in, he didn't play well in all of them. Particularly the second one, he didn't play well. And Tom Brady got to 3-0, but then lost the fourth one. So I immediately removed him from competition for being better than Joe Montana, because that something I also associated with Michael Jordan. To get that label, to be the standard, you can't lose in the championship round. Michael Jordan was 6-0 in the NBA Finals, and I think every other great player had lost at least once. Every single other one. The Magics, the Birds, the Kobe's, the Shaqs, Akeem Olajuwons, the everybody else, even people who've won championships, everybody else has lost at least once. But he was 6-0. And although Terry Bradshaw was also 4-0, and I said Troy Aikman 3-0, along with Montana's 4-0, he played better in the Super Bowls than those guys. I mean, he had 11 touchdowns with no interceptions in 4 Super Bowl, and no guy else played in that many Super Bowls and didn't throw a single interception. His playoff record was 16-7. He only lost 3 playoff games where he played the entire game. 4 others that he was credited with losing, he got knocked out of 3 of the games and got pulled out of the other one against the Vikings. So in reality, when in his playoff record when he plays the entire game was 16-3, you know. And there was a big gap between that second one and the third one. It's like the only playoff games he played the whole game and lost was the 83 NFC Championship game, the 85 wild card game against the Giants, and the last playoff game he played in against the Dolphins in '94. Those are the only playoff games where he played the entire game and lost. And I always felt that he, at his best was better than anybody else's best. When he was at his best, I mean, every great quarterback gets into a groove where it seems like they can do no wrong. But when he was at his best, I can't say I've seen another quarterback that definitely I would say was better than him when it really counted. And I said I've compared them all. Every quarterback that's come along, the Brett Favres, the Kurt Warners, the Tom Brady's, the Peyton Mannings, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, every single one of them, I hold them to that same standard. And every other quarterback has failed the test, either losing Super Bowls or only getting to one and not being able to. And Tom Brady came the closest. As I said, he came the closest, getting the 3 Super Bowls, winning the first 3, and then getting to the fourth one and losing. But it was always eerie to me how, even at the time when Tom Brady first came on the scene, his first few seasons, it was very eerie how similar it was to Joe Montana. How his first 3 Super Bowl appearances, his first Super Bowl he threw 1 touchdown, his second Super Bowl he threw 3 touchdowns, his third Super Bowl he threw 2 touchdowns, the same as Joe Montana. Only difference was in his second Super Bowl he also threw an interception. So that already made it that he couldn't match Joe Montana in that regard, but he still won all three, had the same touchdown total. And even like Joe Montana, his second season as a starter, his team failed to make the playoffs. The 2002 Patriots missed the playoffs like the 82 49ers did. And by his seventh season, he was going for a fourth championship, like Joe Montana by his ninth season as a starter. And comparing Tom Brady in 2007 to Joe Montana in 1989, obviously the Patriots were breaking all passing records with Randy Moss and everything, and you can't really compare the NFL. By 2007, the NFL was very different than it was in 1989. But the season that Brady had versus Montana in terms of going for their fourth championship, in both cases, both guys had their first MVP season. Montana's first in 89, Brady's first in 2007. Both guys had number one offenses. Both guys were heavily favored going into the Super Bowls. And at that very point, when the Super Bowl 42 began, the comparison to me between Tom Brady and Joe Montana ended. As a kid, like I said, up until that point, I saw a lot of parallels. But once the Patriots lost that Super Bowl to the Giants, it didn't matter what Tom Brady did after that. He could have won 10 Super Bowls. It wouldn't have mattered to me. It's being just because you have more Super Bowls than somebody else, more championships doesn't make you better than them. There are plenty of other guys. There are plenty of quarterbacks that people think are better than Troy Aikman that have fewer Super Bowls than him. Having the most championships doesn't make you the best. That makes you the most fortunate because you played in an era that gave you that opportunity. You were healthy enough to play that long, and the competition was weak enough that allowed you to keep going to the Super Bowl year after year. That's good fortune, more so than just being great. And Joe Montana, to me, I've always, as much as John Madden always gave him respect, I always felt that he probably was the most disrespected quarterback of all the quarterbacks who'd accomplish as much as he'd accomplished. I don't think any of them got more disrespect than Joe Montana by the media, because I always associate him and his relationship with the media to Bill Walsh. Bill Walsh was secretive. He wasn't quotable. He didn't give the media a lot to chew on, and the media found him boring. And they liked Mike Ditka. He was entertaining to them. And Joe Montana the same way. The media found Joe Montana boring. He was a bland guy. He didn't give them stuff to, he didn't give them outrageous quotes like Jim McMahon or somebody would do. And he was never a media darling, the way that somebody like when Dan Marino was his big season in 1984 and the lead up to that Super Bowl, Super Bowl 19, the media loved Dan Marino, and Joe Montana was boring. He was, he never had that golden boy reputation that Marino had in 84, or even John Elway hadn't gotten respect prior to the drive. After that drive against the Browns in the 86 AFC Championship game, after that the media gave John Elway respect. Prior to that, the media seemed to be more interested in Bernie Kosar than John Elway. But that drive contributed to him, even though they lost the Super Bowl to the Giants. The very next season, John Elway, they gave him the league MVP. The John Elway had such mediocre numbers in '87, and the Broncos I think were like 10-5, and they gave John Elway the league MVP. That lets you know how much the media had changed their perception of him. Then '87 they liked John Elway, whereas in 1987 Joe Montana had the most touchdown passes, the highest quarterback rating, and his team had the best record of any team in 1987, and yet he did not win the league MVP award. His team had the best record in 81. His team had the best record in 84. His team had the best record in 87, and yet he didn't win the MVP any of those years. Usually, a guy now, especially nowadays, people are accustomed, since now the MVP award over the last 20 years has become just the best quarterback award. People are accustomed to whatever quarterback has the best numbers wins the league MVP. Whereas back then, it was seen to be such a popularity contest. The guy that the media liked won the league MVP. It wasn't about statistics. And that continued even into the 90s with Brett Favre. Brett Favre winning 3 straight league MVPs. It wasn't that he didn't have great seasons, but there are a lot of guys that have great seasons who don't win the MVP every year. I mean, the media, they could have given Michael Jordan a league MVP every year, but the media didn't. The media would always, every couple of years, they would figure, you know what, we can't do that. We got to give it to Charles Barkley. We have to give it to Karl Malone, because it'd be too boring to just keep giving the MVP to the same guy who's the best player. But Brett Favre was able to avoid that because the media really, in the mid 90s, the media really liked Brett Favre because of his the playfulness he showed on the football field and didn't seem to take it that seriously. And the media loved him, and they gave him 3 straight MVPs. That so often the voting for all these things, just like the Hall of Fame, it's a popularity contest where it's not about facts. And and Joe Montana, he never was the most popular of quarterbacks. And it said by 1988 or so, he was just thought of as some old washed up QB, injured, and even though he was only like in his early 30s, again, they let you know how different it was back in the 80s, where a 31-year-old quarterback back then was thought of as old, whereas now 31-year-old quarterback is young. Joe Montana, no quarterback had to do more to get respect than Joe Montana. Joe Montana had to win 3 Super Bowls before he got any respect. I can't think of another player who had to do that. Like I said, Dan Marino never had to win any Super Bowls to get respect. You know, and the media was always in love with Dan Marino and always obsessively talking about what records he was breaking. Whereas Joe Montana had to win 3 championships before the media spoke of him with any reverence at all. And if you listen to the commentaries of games he played in 1988 and before that, and you compare them to the commentaries of the games he played in 1989, it's totally different. After they won their 3rd Super Bowl, the 1989 season, the media actually spoke of Joe Montana with respect. They actually spoke about him like he was one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play. And they did not speak of him like that at all before 89. His team had to be the team of the decade before the 49ers, before he got any respect. And even the 49ers as a team, like I said, the media was rooting for, in the 80s, the media wanted the Bears to be the team of the decade. They would have wanted the Dolphins to be a team of the decade. The media would have preferred if the Giants were the team of the decade. Especially in the mid 80s, after the Bears won and the Giants won, the media wanted them to keep winning. But the Bears kept getting knocked out of the playoffs by the Redskins. And after they won their championship in 86, the Giants missed the playoffs back to back years. Yet the 49ers were always around. And the media, after they won their 3rd championship, the media said, all right, I guess we got to give the 49ers respect. And the media would have preferred one of those other teams be the team of the decade. But you can't ignore a team when they win 3 or 4 championships in a decade. You can't ignore them. And of all the teams that came closest to winning 3 straight championships, the 1990 49ers came the closest. Even though the Chiefs played in 3 straight Super Bowls and then got blown out in that third one, of all those teams that came the closest, the 1990 49ers, all it took was one hit that Joe Montana didn't see coming, and that dream came to an end. But they came the closest. Had he played that entire game, they would have won that game, and they would have won 3 in a row. Joe Montana's greatest flaw was injuries, of course, because he was kind of a wiry guy. He wasn't a big, strong guy, especially like quarterbacks today. Quarterbacks now are accustomed. We're accustomed now to 6'5", 240-pound quarterbacks. And you looked at Joe Montana and compared him to quarterbacks today, like he couldn't even play quarterback today. He looked so small, and he was injured all the time. And one of the main reasons he was injured was that consistently throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, the 49ers consistently had one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL. Joe Montana was always injured and behind that bad offensive line. Bill Walsh's offense was built around the quarterback getting rid of the ball fast because the offensive line couldn't hold up under intense pressure. Like I said, I always say that hit that Joe Montana took from Jim Burt in that playoff game against the Giants after the '86 season, I've never seen another quarterback take a hit like that from a nose tackle. I've seen quarterbacks get hit like that by DBs or linebackers blitzing. I've never seen a quarterback get hit right up the middle by a nose tackle. That lets you know how bad that offensive line was. And even after Joe Montana was gone and Steve Young was the quarterback of the 49ers, he was getting hit all the time. He was injured all the time. Sometimes it was his own doing with his running back instincts, running and getting hurt, getting tackled in a awkward way. But even when he was back and just dropping back to pass, he got hit way more often than a quarterback is supposed to get hit. And but they never had a good offensive line. And Bill Walsh was well aware of that. That's why Bill Walsh was always drawn to mobile quarterbacks because he knew from the very beginning the 49ers had a bad offensive line. And he needed a quarterback that could get out to evade the pass rush and even use that as an excuse when he would take out Steve DeBerg and put in Joe Montana. And then, of course, years later, use it as an excuse, like in that playoff game against the Vikings when he took out Montana and put in Steve Young, that he could use Steve Young's mobility to get away from the pass rush. And because of that injury, but that being prone to injury was, of course, the reason why he ended up losing his job, that he was taken out of action so long that the team didn't want to give him his job back. Where had he, and of course, had Joe Montana not gotten injured prior to the 90, he didn't hurt his elbow and miss the whole 91 season. What would have become of Steve Young? I always found it really odd that Steve Young was still the quarterback for the 49ers by 1991. You would have thought after the 89 season that he would have said, to hell with this. Montana is never going to, they're never going to give me the job over Montana. You thought he would have asked to be traded after the 89 season. Yet the 90 season came along and he was still the backup. And he hardly played in the 1990 season because Joe Montana, that was one of the few years where Joe Montana didn't miss a lot of games. He played in 15 of the 16 games that year. And yet by 1991, Steve Young was still there. It seemed like somebody had promised him the job, that it was only a matter of time. Because you would have thought Steve Young, by after the 89 season, he would have asked to be traded. And I always found that awkward that he was still there. That some other team would have been trying to get a hold of him. As long as Joe Montana was healthy, they weren't just gonna tell Joe it's Steve Young's job. They were looking for the perfect opportunity to tell Joe, all right, Steve's the quarterback, and you're not getting the job back. Because when he missed that whole season in '91, they had to make a decision. We're gonna either disrespect Montana by benching him, a four-time Super Bowl champion, benching him for getting injured, or we're going to give the job to the 30-year-old quarterback that hasn't played that much, who can be our quarterback for the next 10 years. So the 35-year-old quarterback who's injured all the time, who more than likely is only going to play for a couple of more years, we have to choose between him or the guy who's going to play for the next 10 years. It was an easy decision in that regard because the organization had the same mentality that Bill Walsh had, thinking about the future. And losing his job due to an injury, it's like Joe Montana's departure from San Francisco always demonstrated to me how quickly things change in the NFL. All it took was one hit that Joe Montana didn't see coming, and his career with the 49ers was over. Like everybody who attended that 1990 NFC Championship game thought they were going to see the culmination of the greatest dynasty in the history of football in San Francisco going to a fifth Super Bowl, and no one thought that they were going to see Joe Montana as the starting quarterback for the 49ers for the last time. Nobody. All it took was one hit that he didn't see coming, and his career was over with the 49ers. And and he's the league MVP in 1990, two-time league MVP, four-time Super Bowl champion. By 1992, he's a backup. By 1993, he's on another team. It reminded me of Kurt Warner. 2001, Kurt Warner, two-time league MVP, been to two Super Bowls in the past 3 years. By 2003, he's a backup. By 2004, he's on another team. And things change real fast. And again, Kurt Warner also had an injury that caused him to lose his job to a younger quarterback too. Injuries and age change, things real fast, and especially when a quarterback has a lot of pride. And I say because Joe Montana, his whole being juggled with Steve Young by Bill Walsh, that obviously hurt his pride. He obviously was a prideful man because his whole experience with the Kansas City Chiefs was all about pride. He didn't want to retire having lost his job to Steve Young. It was him going to the Chiefs was all about proving something. It was all about pride, seeing what he had left in the tank. He wanted to prove to the 49ers that he wasn't done because clearly they chose Steve Young because they thought that he was done. He was injury prone, old quarterback that had nothing left in the tank, couldn't hold up for a full season and lead a team to a championship. And they ended up being proven right, being in the best opportunity the Chiefs had to win was in '93. But of course, that season for Montana ended the way the 1990 season ended, with him getting knocked out of a playoff game. Now, if Joe Montana had stayed with the 49ers for a couple of more years, could they have won one more championship like Steve Young did? I don't know. Could he have held up? Because I would have loved, one of the things that I wished I had seen, I wish I had gotten to see Joe Montana's 49ers against Jimmy Johnson's Cowboys. Because we only ever saw Steve Young's 49ers against Jimmy Johnson's Cowboys. But if had Joe Montana played in those games, would it have made any difference? I don't know. Joe Montana might have had less success even than Steve Young. I don't know. Because definitely by that period of time, that Joe Montana in the early 90s physically, if he didn't get perfect pass protection, he couldn't hold up because he was so beat up by then. But nowadays, of course, at the time, it was seen as an unusual thing to have a player of that stature in his career playing for another team. But of course, now it's just everybody sees it as normal. And it's always about pride. Anytime a veteran player goes to another team for the last couple of years of their career, it's usually because the team they played with for most of their career is telling them, we don't think you're a starter anymore, and we want to move on as a franchise. I'm sure that's the reason Jerry Rice left the 49ers. The 49ers felt that he was too old and he wasn't a starting wide receiver anymore, and they wanted to put somebody else in there, and he said, "The hell with you," and he went to the Raiders. And a lot of guys do that. He said we were so accustomed to, Favre with the Vikings, the Jets, and then the Vikings, or Aaron Rodgers with the Steelers and the Jets, and Brady with the Buccaneers, and we're so accustomed to guys going to other teams at the end of their careers, and it's always about pride. It's never because they need the money. It rarely is because they're going to a team to win a championship for the first time. Sometimes that's the case if the guy hadn't won a title, but a lot of time it's just about pride, of them just not wanting to admit that their time is up, even if they're physically in decline. And obviously when Montana went to the Chiefs physically, he was. I mean, Montana hadn't physically been in his prime since probably 1984. If he had a physical prime at all, it was 84. But definitely after his back surgery and everything, he was physically he didn't run and didn't move the way he did previously. And by the early 90s, he was so prone to injury that he couldn't hold, unless he got perfect pass protection, he couldn't hold up. And I also want to point out that being prone to injury isn't a sign of lack of toughness. Some people might suggest that just because a guy is injured a lot, that's proof that he's, not very tough. Um, Guys that avoid injury just have good fortune. I remember the media used to always fixate on the fact that Brett Favre never missed a game, and may try to make it seem like he was the toughest guy in football because he was a quarterback and didn't miss games. And it had nothing to do with toughness. Anybody who avoids injury, it's always a product of good fortune. You just didn't get hit in a way to get injured. Tough guys get injured all the time in sports. The toughest guys get injured. Anyone who avoids injury just has good fortune. Think about somebody like Jim McMahon. Jim McMahon was just unfortunate. It wasn't that Jim McMahon lacked toughness. He was prone to injury more so than Joe Montana. Injuries completely stunted his career, and he didn't have the career that he should have had because he was so injury prone. But it had nothing to do with him lacking toughness. Joe Montana was more fortunate than Jim McMahon, although he still only played the equivalent of about 10 years worth of games. which of course another link between him and Bill Walsh, that Bill Walsh only coached for 10 years. So there are a lot of other people who had a lot more opportunities to succeed than those two guys and actually accomplished a lot less. You don't see that many players or coaches accomplish so much in such a short period of time. After them, saw quarterbacks who played 15, 20 years, like Peyton Manning or Drew Brees, accomplish so much less. It always stands out to me. I mean, Peyton Manning, of course, regular season statistics, his statistics obviously would dwarf Joe Montana's playing as long as he did. He played in 4 Super Bowls, didn't play well in really in any of them. And Drew Brees he played 20 years and only played in 1 Super Bowl. And again, that's a guy like Tom Brady played 20 years. So obviously he's going to have not only better regular season numbers, he had greater opportunity to win more championships. Yeah. Just like Bill Belichick. You compare Brady obviously played for 20 years and Belichick coached for over 20 years. So you couldn't really compare their accomplishments to Montana or Bill Walsh, guys that only played or coached for 10 years. I always associate I always associate Joe Montana with Phil Simms. Their careers overlapped so much. Much like as much as Dan Marino and John Elway, you know, Joe Montana and Phil Simms were drafted the same year. They retired 1 year apart from each other. The 49ers and the Giants were, bitter rivals for years, so they were always sort of those franchises were always associated with each other for like a 10, 15-year period. And there were also a lot of parallels between the careers of Joe Montana and Phil Simms. How both guys had injury problems, both of them dealt with quarterback controversies, and both of them at one point late in their careers lost their starting jobs primarily due to injury. Phil Simms was very injury prone early in his career and had to deal with a quarterback controversy with Scott Brunner early in the early 80s. And it wasn't until 1984, although he was drafted in 79, he didn't become the starter until 1984. And obviously, Bill Parcells had confidence in him to give him that job. And although the Giants for years were primarily, they were built around their defense as much as the Bears were. And if Phil Simms played well, it was just a plus. They were asking for him more to just not make mistakes. His first playoff loss as a starter was to the 49ers, and his last playoff loss was also to the 49ers in 1993, the last game that he and Lawrence Taylor ever played in, when the 49ers beat the Giants 44-3. And regarding Joe Montana, the first playoff game he ever started was, of course, against the Giants in 1981. And the last playoff game that he started with the 49ers was also against the Giants, the 1990 NFC Championship game. And that's why I always associate those two guys. There are so many parallels. Of course, Joe Montana had plenty of injuries throughout his career, and Joe Montana, of course, due to an injury that caused him to miss a significant amount of time, and the franchise used that as an excuse to give Steve Young the job permanently. And Phil Simms, near the end of the 1990 season, got an injury that caused Jeff Hostetler to get the starting job, and Jeff Hostetler was a starter through the playoffs and won the Super Bowl. And with the coaching change the next year, Phil Simms lost the coach chose Jeff Hostetler over Phil Simms. The difference was Phil Simms, of course, didn't have the stature of Joe Montana, and he sort of bit his lip and just accepted being a backup. Whereas with Joe Montana, there was no way in hell, after all he'd accomplished and all the time that he spent trying to keep that job from Steve Young, that he was going to just be Steve Young's backup simply because he got injured. He bit his lip in '92, but but he didn't want to affect the team's success. So he just kept his mouth shut during the '92 season, but in the off season made his decision of where he was going to go. But Phil Simms, because he bit his lip, and stayed the backup. Eventually, Jeff Hostetler, because he was another one of those journeyman quarterbacks, a backup that convinced people that he was a starter because he was on a Super Bowl winning team. Eventually, Jeff Hostetler left and went to the Raiders, and Phil Simms got the starting job back. So Phil Simms ended up retiring a Giant, whereas Joe Montana, last year's was with some other team. So that lets you know the difference in stature between Montana and Phil Simms. Like there's no way in hell Joe Montana would have swallowed his pride and been Steve Young's backup for like the last 2 years of his career. Because Steve Young wasn't going anywhere, unlike Jeff Hostetler. So if he was going to retire, he was going to with the 49ers, he was going to retire a backup, and there was no way he was going to take that. But I always associate Phil Simms and Joe Montana because they said their careers overlap like Marino and Elway, but there are more parallels. I'm sure there are a lot of people who figure, oh, there's no way in hell that Patrick Mahomes would end his career with another team. But history has shown it can happen to anybody. Injury and age, you know, change everything. And it doesn't matter how much success you had. If you're old enough and injured enough, the franchise and the franchise has another option. There's always a possibility you're going to get cast aside for someone else. And I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now Patrick Mahomes was on another team. And that whole experience, the way Montana left the 49ers is the reason why I always find it hilarious when people expect players to be loyal to franchises, because the franchises are never loyal to the players. The franchises are always disregard after they've achieved a lot of success with a player, they have no problem casting that player aside to thinking about their own future, saying their time is up. We don't care what you've done for us. We want to move on without you. They never feel any loyalty. That's why I never have a problem with a player looking out for himself and saying to hell with the franchise, because the franchise, these teams are never loyal to the players ever. I never criticize an athlete for not being loyal to a franchise. That's something those geeks that are obsessive fans of certain teams have that mentality where they hate a player and complain that a player is not loyal to the team because they left. But I understand the 49ers perspective in choosing Steve Young over Joe Montana. And it's funny because that Steve Young and Joe Montana quarterback controversy, there were a lot of quarterback controversies in the 1980s all over the NFL. So there were so many teams that had two different quarterbacks who they were sort of going back and forth with. And but the Steve Young and Joe Montana one lasted for so long. It lasted from the moment Steve Young arrived in the with the 49ers, even after Joe Montana had left, even after Joe Montana had retired. The media, it seemed like a football game, the 49ers could not play a football game without commentators or media making reference to Joe Montana, and usually in a derogatory way to build up Steve Young, because the media always wants to promote the idea that whoever is currently playing is the greatest, and they spend a lot of time putting down players of the past to build them up. And even after Montana retired, they'd always say, "Oh, Steve Young was breaking this 49er record. He broke this Montana record." You know, that, oh, Steve Young has all the 49er records. They couldn't stop saying over and over again to build up Steve Young. They could, even when Montana retired, the media could not leave him alone. And said John Madden was the only one that felt like they didn't take shots at him. I remember a game in 1998 where Randy Cross, who was a center for the 49ers with Joe Montana for years, said that Steve Young was running that 49er offense better than anyone had ever run it, including Joe Montana. He said that. It's like they could not, the 49ers could not have a game without referencing Joe Montana in some way. Like, even I felt that referring to that catch after the 1998 season in that wild card game against the Packers, referring to it as the catch to me was a shot at Joe Montana. It was the people saying, well, Joe, now Steve Young has his catch. Even though that catch was meaningless, it was a wild card game against a team that had beaten the 49ers 3 straight years, and the 49ers lost the very next week to the Falcons. It meant nothing. It wasn't the beginning of anything, whereas the catch was the beginning of the 49ers winning 4 championships in the 80s. referring to that as a catch too always just made me want to throw up because it felt like just a shot at Joe Montana. Like even the very night of Steve Young's very last game, the night where he got his last concussion, when he walks off the field after being knocked unconscious, getting up and walking off the field, the the broadcast put a graphic up on the screen showing that Steve Young had a higher career winning percentage than Joe Montana. You had Joe Montana, you had Steve, you had like Steve Young, Joe Montana, and Roger Staubach on the list. But again, even that very night of his last game, they had to take a shot at Joe Montana. It's showing, see, Steve Young's better than Joe Montana. They could not help themselves. And I said that he was Joe Montana to me, and it always was puzzling to me because Joe Montana never did anything to get people to always take shots at him like that. He never had derogatory things to say about anyone else. He was the kind of guy who you couldn't imagine, although I'm sure he's been very angry, he never publicly expressed it. You know, he never wore his emotions on his sleeve. And so that's why he got that nickname Joe Cool. You never saw him throwing tantrums on the sideline, you know, regardless of how bad things might be. It never seemed to affect him. And that's why I never understood why he was so disrespected by people because he never asked for it, you know. And till this day, I'm still waiting for someone to top him. The last time that I saw a player that I was convinced he was going to actually be the guy that was actually going to challenge Montana was Aaron Rodgers back in 2010 when the Packers won the Super Bowl. But of course, Aaron Rodgers never got back to another Super Bowl. That was the last time with his mobility and his accuracy and his efficiency. I thought Aaron Rodgers was going to be the one, but of course he only played one Super Bowl. Yeah. And I'm still waiting for some other guy to come along. I'm not one of those people who refers to Joe Montana as the greatest. I don't refer to anybody ever as the greatest of all time. It's an idiotic expression, that goat bullshit. I hate that. You know, I always say that he's the best quarterback that I've ever seen. And I'm still waiting for someone else to come along and top his accomplishments. If somebody does it, I'll give them credit. If another quarterback comes along and wins 4 or more championships, plays great in all of them, you know, throws nothing but touchdowns, no interceptions, I'll gladly give them credit if it happens. But up until this point, it hasn't happened. That's why even to this day, I would still say Joe Montana is the standard. Thank you.